Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this second live stream for the Gender Representation in the Media course. If you've got to week 4 of the course, you'll be quite familiar with me by now, I think. My name's Karen Boyle from the University of Strathclyde. So if you've got any questions you want to pose live during the chat today, please do so just by typing in the chat window and we'll try and get to those questions as well. But I wanted to start by thanking you all for some really fantastic contributions over the last 4 weeks. And most of the questions that we've not yet had the opportunity to address through our responses to you on the online course itself are to do with this week's focus on violence. So I just want to say at the beginning that if you've not reached the end of week 4 yet, and so you're not entirely aware of what's coming up, just a reminder that on the introduction to the week 4 content, we've got quite a lot of information about support services and dealing with these kind of topics around violence. So please do check those out if you haven't had a chance to do so. So I wanted to start on a positive note by highlighting a couple of really useful observations from participants in the class about where things have improved in relation to thinking about representations of violence. So Belen, thank you for your comments about the way that in Latin America the shifting of reporting around crimes of passion has been really important. And I think that illustrates how feminist interventions in that area, challenging this idea that men's violence against women is an act of passion, it's an uncontrollable act, have been really successful. And what you pointed us to there is the way that the term femicide or femicido has become incredibly common parlance in Latin America in particular. And that's a really powerful term, femicide, because it highlights the murder of women because they are women. So I think that recognition, that shift away from thinking about these crimes as uncontrollable, as acts of passion, as really about romance or sex, has been incredibly important. So thank you for highlighting that. And Dola made a really helpful point, I think, about Me Too. And in my own work, I've always tried to highlight the ambivalence of something like Me Too. Lots has been achieved through the hashtag Me Too and the work that's followed on from it, which doesn't mean we've not still got some way to go. But I really liked Dola's point that one of the things that Me Too, hashtag Me Too, has really achieved is that overall we're now a lot more fluent in the language of sexual violence. So culturally, that there's more understanding of how women experience sexual violence. And I think that's a really important point for us to remember. We may not be where we want to be yet in terms of actually challenging and changing that reality, but the fact that we're now able to talk about it in a particular way is a really important step. So thank you for that. And your comments have also been really helpful in flagging up some of the areas where we do still need to change things. So I noticed in your discussions this week there was quite a lot of reference to discussions about men who perpetrate violence in general, but violence against women in particular, as being monsters and what some of the limitations of that are. Now, you may have seen that I wrote a blog last week on exactly this. It's a blog series for Gender Equal Media Scotland, and we'll share the link for that again on the course. But it was looking at precisely this idea that there are limitations in constructing men who abuse women and men who commit violence generally as monsters. And that was really brought home to me yesterday. I don't know if any of you are currently following the media coverage of Harvey Weinstein's trial in New York, but in her closing statements yesterday, Weinstein's lead attorney, Donna Rotuno, made the point that she wanted the jury to recognise that Weinstein was not the monster that the defence wanted them to believe that he was. And I thought that was a really significant phrase, and one that should really give us pause about the limitations of constructing men as monsters, because I think part of what Rutuna's strategy has been to say, look, he's not a monster, he's a man, and therefore if we think about him as a man, he can't possibly be guilty of the things that he's been accused of. So I think that's a really contemporary example of what some of the limitations of that discourse of men as monsters, when they're accused of sexual crime, some of those limitations can be. And I think also in the Weinstein trial there's been an awful lot of evidence, an awful lot of discussion about things like physical appearance and trying to monsterise, if you like, Weinstein through reference to his physical size, his smell, his spots, his body odour, you know, those kinds of things, naked photos used of him in court. And whilst obviously sometimes it's relevant to think about perpetrators or accused perpetrators' physicality, so for instance it's relevant to know their relative size, if an argument's being made about their ability to pin someone down, for instance, I do think we need to be careful that it doesn't become a narrative that perpetuates this notion that only ugly men would rape because attractive men would have sex offered to them at all times, because that really perpetuates that idea that rape is only about sex, and that's something we might need to challenge. So thank you to those of you that have engaged with that question of monsters and what that means. And Zara had really helpfully given some additional examples of that in a fictional context as well, thinking about the queer coding of villains in film. And whilst we talked in the article and in some of our course materials about the queer coding of villains in thrillers and horror in particular, Zara gave a really useful example of what might seem to be a much more innocuous example, the queer coding of characters in Disney movies. And I learned something new, as I have done throughout this course, which was that apparently the character of Ursula in The Little Mermaid was based on the queer performer Divine, which I didn't know, and now I do, so thank you for that. Okay, so one of the other points, and I'm keeping an eye, sorry, my computer's logged off, but I'm trying to keep an eye on your questions as we go here. So please do post them if you have any questions you want to pose. One of the other points I really wanted to highlight that a few of you have mentioned, which I thought was really helpful, was the idea that when stories break that relate to non-recent or historic cases of sexual abuse, there's a tendency within much media coverage to use a sort of defence of the perpetrator or accused perpetrator that's along the line of, oh, but it was a different time back then, you know, the standards were different, behaviour was different, we didn't know then what we knew now. And I think it's really, I've seen that a lot in my own work. I saw it when I was working on the Jimmy Savile case in the UK. Jimmy Savile was a broadcaster, a DJ, a charity fundraiser who was a really prominent figure of the British radio and television landscape for decades. And following his death, it was revealed that he'd sexually abused children, boys and girls, and adult women over around 4 decades, and the number of people coming forward was in the hundreds. And one of the arguments we frequently saw in the press at that time was that we were supposed to understand that at the height of Savile's fame, and also at the height of when he was abusing children and women in the 70s and 80s, it was a different time and the rules about sexual conduct were different. And one of the arguments I've made in my work on Savile is that this is an argument, when the media put forward this argument, they're accepting the accused perpetrator's stand and understanding of what he's done. And it doesn't hold up culturally, because when Savile was accused of abusing children and women, was also the height of the second wave feminist movement in the UK, and one of the key things that movement had really highlighted was the issue of men's violence against women and children. So the idea that the entire culture didn't think this was a problem is spurious at best, but more damagingly, the idea that no one thought this is a problem completely rejects the testimony given by Savills victims and survivors, where they recount in often painful detail, knowing at the time that these things happen that it wasn't a bit of fun, that it wasn't a joke, and indeed many of the people who subsequently came forward after Savills' death also talked about the way they tried to report during his lifetime. So they knew something was wrong, they tried to report, whether to friends, family, or indeed to institutions, but nothing happened. So if we go back to Dola's point that we're now more fluent in the age of Me Too with the language of sexual violence, I think I'd add to that we're perhaps better at hearing the stories of sexual violence, and that's a really, really important difference. But when you come across that different times analysis, it was a different time back then, I'd really encourage you to think about a different time for whom, and what about the victim and survivors and their understandings of what happened. One other area that's come up quite a bit in the discussions this week is a kind of questioning of whether we can think about, say, particular news agencies or particular genres as, in general, being good or bad at dealing with men's violence against women. Quite a few comments have thought, for instance, about the liberal-leaning newspaper The Guardian, and made the argument that The Guardian is generally good at this stuff. And I suppose one thing I'd just like to highlight here is that our understanding of gender and violence is continually evolving, and that's all of our understandings of these issues. It's evolving as more women, children, men, and non-binary folks come forward to talk about their experiences, and as we understand more about their experiences and also about the way they've been treated by the media, by the police, by the judicial services, by support services, we can refine our understanding of violence and the appropriate way to talk about it. And so what I think is really important is that we think about who are the experts here. And we've talked a lot this week about survivors as being experts, and I think that is important, but I'm going to come on to some caveats around that in a wee minute. But the other thing I'd say is, what expertise would we use to inform our position? So this partly arose through the step where we've given headlines from articles and tried to challenge the way that sensationalising language is often used in headlines. There's been a really useful discussion, so thank you for this, about whether the term child prostitute is ever appropriate. And I'm drawing here and saying, no, I don't think it is appropriate, and it's not a term we should be using, on the expert advice given by organisations that work supporting children and young people who've experienced abuse, both in and outside of that framework of the sex industry. And so I think it's really important that we ask what expertise should inform our position. So I've posted in the comments a couple of links to media guidelines produced by the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, as well as by Zero Tolerance, who you've heard from a couple of times already this week. So I really recommend you have a look at those, because what they do is they draw on their expertise of working with survivors over decades, as well as working with media organisations and with other organisations that are involved in policy or support in this area. So I think one of the things for us really to think about is, what expertise do we need to help us make these decisions, and to be self-reflexive. I know that I've been working in this area for longer than I care to mention, and the way I write and talk about these issues has shifted, and it's shifted because of changing knowledge and of the way that our understanding of the debates has changed. And I think that's a really important thing that we don't assume that knowledge in this area is 100% fixed, and we're always ready to learn more. Okay, so now on to some specific questions. So thanks for these. Tamara, thank you. You'd asked about what I thought about using photos of couples or families in domestic homicide cases. So these are cases where the press might be reporting on cases where usually, but not always, a man has murdered his family or members of his family, and then himself. Not always and then himself. Sometimes he's on trial for the murder of members of his family. And I agree, I find that troubling too. And I think one of the reasons I find it troubling is that it's often used to accompany a narrative that's sort of, this is a really good upstanding guy, he's a good family man, he's a, respected member of the community, and he just snapped. And actually, when you dig down into these cases, what's usually behind them is some kind of history of domestic abuse, coercive control, and other forms of control, threats and abuse within the family. So I think that's really troubling, because it kind of hides that, it glosses over that. I think another reason it's troubling is that it only allows us to see access to the victim as she's defined by him. So she's only ever seen with the man who killed her, rather than, for instance, with her friends or children or other family members, or indeed, sometimes it might be appropriate that she's seen with co-workers or something like that. So I think it's unhelpful in both those ways, that it disguises what often, not always, but often went on in the relationship. And also it defines the survivor only in relation to perpetrator. So yes, like you, Tamara, I'm worried about these things. I suppose the only caveat I'd add there is that where I think it's a positive is that using those kinds of photographs, not photographs of the couple or the family specifically, but using those kind of photographs that we all take for photo albums or, for family albums. Where I think that is positive is that it challenges that monster narrative that we talked about a bit earlier. So the idea that men who commit violent crimes are easily and immediately recognisable because they're all monsters. So the positive to the use of those kind of photographs is that they can challenge that and really encourage us to think about the banality, the normality of that kind of violence. But I think that the negatives generally outweigh the positives. But I'd be interested to know what you think, Tamara and others, and if that echoes your concerns, please add your comments in the comments online. I'd love to hear more. Because I suppose the other thing I'd say just in relation to that is that way of challenging abusers look like monsters can happen through using other photos that aren't photos of the couple or the family. So it can be photos of the perpetrator arriving in court, or the accused perpetrator arriving in court, or photographs of him on his own in different contexts. So there's different ways of doing that, I think. Okay, I'm just going to take a few other questions. Nikki, you'd asked what I thought of the term interpersonal violence. Really good question. I suppose, as in the article that we set this week, I'd say that the article on naming, I should say. I'd say that I don't think there's any such thing as one term that works in all contexts. And there probably are contexts where the term interpersonal violence is really helpful. So some of the other terms that we've got at our disposal, like intimate partner violence, sorry, my mind went blank, intimate partner violence or domestic violence or abuse, those terms tend to be understood relatively narrowly in terms of the range of relationships that they encompass. And sometimes you want to point to a different range of relationships that might be outside of family structures, that might involve siblings, or that might involve people that know one another but not in those kind of intimate relationships. So I can see that then something like interpersonal violence is quite helpful. I suppose the question I would always ask is, what does the term allow and what does it deny or disguise? So I would be worried about a term like interpersonal violence being used as an umbrella term to talk about the kinds of abuse we've talked about on the course this week, because I think it's problematic because it's a gender neutral term, so it disguises who's doing what to whom, and therefore it might stop us thinking about what are some of the ways in which we can genuinely challenge that. So I'm never saying never, I'm never saying that wouldn't be a helpful term to use, but I suppose the question I'd always encourage you to think about is, what work does this language do for me? What does it allow me to say? But also, what does it stop me saying, or what does it stop me seeing in terms of the kinds of violence, the relationship between victim and perpetrator, and any patterns in terms of gender or any other structural inequalities in terms of who's doing what to whom. So yeah, thank you for that question. Lexi, you'd noted very helpfully an ambivalence I also feel, and I think came through in some of the content this week, I hope it did, which is about the pressure on women to tell their stories. Whose responsibility should it be to tell the stories about gender and violence in the public domain? And I share that concern. I think Me Too has, the Me Too moment the last few years, on the one hand, the outpouring of testimony from victim survivors has been incredibly powerful. I worry, as do many other researchers in this area, and a lot of people working, certainly the people I talk with working in support organisations, worry that it has become an imperative to speak out, and that there's an assumption that if something really happened and it was really bad, then it's your responsibility to tell that story. And I don't think we should ever be putting that kind of pressure on survivors. I think Susie Angus's contributions this week have been really powerful in reminding us why survivors might want to speak out, but also on how the conditions of speaking out can really make that either a powerful and empowering experience for survivors, or one that is disempowering and distressing. So I'm really struck by the contrast that Susie establishes between the video that she and her Speak Out survivor sisters made with the support of Rape Crisis Scotland, which was them telling their own stories but doing so in their terms and in order to arrive at a campaign point, which is about changing the law on corroboration, against what happened when mainstream news agencies took hold of that story. And the thing that Susie really seized on, that description of her as defeated, and her really wanting an opportunity to speak back to that and say, you know, yes, this happened to me. No, I'm not defeated. Look at the activism, look at the issue that we're pushing on. So I think there's always got to be a balance. And I suppose the one other thing I'd say about that is that for media organisations, I do totally understand that individual stories are very, very powerful, and they help make these kind of stories matter to people, and can help change attitudes. And I'd never underestimate how important that is. I'd also say that we've got at least 4 decades worth of expertise in research, in support organisations, advocacy and activism organisations that work with survivors, who can speak about these points then in general terms, drawing on their decades of experience in hearing the stories of survivors without us having to necessarily exploit those survivors all over again by getting them to tell their stories. So I think I'd love to see organisations like Rape Crisis, Zero Tolerance, the organisations you've heard from this week, being more centrally the go-to for news reporting on these issues. But I should also add that for any of that to happen, these organisations have got to be properly funded, and that's always a challenge. Certainly it is in the UK. I'd love to hear from you elsewhere if you feel that that's also an issue, or if things have shifted. So I've got 2 more questions I'm going to tackle. So if you do have any other questions you'd like to pose before I get to the end of those, please do so by adding in your questions in the chat window just now. But the last 2 questions I want to answer are from Elena and Irene. So thanks for your questions. Elena, you'd asked about how do we balance safety advice with putting responsibility on perpetrators. And I think that's a great question, and I want to take it in 2 different ways, if I may. So I want to talk about it, first of all, in relation to, if you like, campaigns. So a number of years ago, I did a piece of work that was looking at campaigns challenging men's violence against women internationally, mainly poster campaigns. And we found exactly what you've talked about there, that a number of campaigns that were seeking to challenge men's violence were aiming to do so by asking women to change their behaviour. And I think the first thing to say is that's never appropriate. We will never end men's violence against women by changing women's behaviour. And so I'd love to see that emphasis or balance shift. Someone in the comments, and I'm sorry I've forgotten who, but someone in the comments had pointed out that Brenna Jessie, who we heard from this week, had been following her on Twitter, and last weekend she'd retweeted a correction to a police statement, a police tweet about it's coming up to the weekend and here's how to stay safe, that was telling women how to look after their drinks. It didn't specifically name women, but it was here's how to stay safe, here's how to look after your drinks, here's how to get home safely. And she'd challenged that in the same way as the Rape Crisis Top Tips to Stop Rape that we shared with you this week does. She turned that on its head by saying, it's the weekend, here's how to stay safe, don't rape someone. And I think it's quite depressing that we still need to be getting that message out. So in terms of campaign materials around stopping rape, for instance, the emphasis should always be on changing men's behaviours, I would say, not on safety advice, if the focus of the campaign is stopping rape. There are absolutely times when giving some kinds of safety advice can be incredibly helpful, but I think that safety advice always has to be framed as safety advice and not ways to stop rape. In the same way as you never frame things like advice about, how to put an eye. One thing I noticed recently in a Police Scotland campaign for student safety, it was a booklet Police Scotland had produced giving students advice on personal safety, and there was advice about how to stop, or there was advice about bikes, basically about looking after your bikes on campus, and it was saying things like, please put I can't remember the specifics now, but it was something about put a particular code on your bike, on the actual frame of your bike, so that if it is stolen, we can do the following things. Now that to me is a very different kind of bit of advice, because it's saying, look, we understand that by having a bike, by owning a bike, you are not asking for that bike to be stolen. Here are some ways in which if you own a bike, you can take some precautions that mean that if someone does steal that bike, we might be able to return it to you. And that's a very different piece of advice than another bit of the same booklet, which was about covering your drinks. And, this is what you need to do to avoid having your drinks spiked. And so I think that emphasis needs to be different. I'm not against anti-drink spiking measures, but again, we've got to be really careful that that doesn't put the emphasis on women to make sure their drinks aren't spiked, rather than on men not to spike women's drinks. So Elena, I agree it's a difficult balance sometimes, but it's really important we get that right. So I said I'd talk about it in relation to campaigns. I think the other place we need to think about it, obviously, is in relation to the media. And so the media can pick up on big campaigns, for instance, run by the police, and then amplify those in particular ways. And I suppose one of the key ways that often happens is in relation to if there's deemed to be a particularly heightened risk of crime at a particular moment. And I was struck, I think it was Irene had mentioned in comments about the Yorkshire Ripper case in the UK, and that's a lot of years ago now. He was arrested in 1981, but he was a serial killer who was targeting women in Yorkshire in England. And whilst he was killing women, the police issued safety advice to women about staying indoors, basically about a curfew on women. There was lots of feminist resistance and campaigning against this. The media exacerbated it in lots of ways by reproducing this kind of safety advice. And a lot of the feminists active at that point were like, okay, we want to actually ensure that this man does not kill any more women. What's more effective than asking women to stay home? Asking men to stay home and saying to them, do you know what, if you're out on the street after a certain time at night, you should assume that the police might pick you up on as being a suspect. Now, of course, that would never happen because there are lots of reasons why men would need to be on the street at night, just as there are lots of reasons why women would be. But by turning that round, they were really aiming to make that point about where do we need to place responsibility. So the media have got a really important role to play in how they manage and express risk around things like serial crime. We're seeing it in a completely different context at the moment in terms of the panic that's being sort of generated and reported in the press around coronavirus. And that idea of a moral panic, of the press like whipping up a panic and asking us to change our behaviour in particular ways, is one we'll maybe return to in some of the comments, I think, but it'd be really interesting to hear more of your thoughts on that. Okay, so I think we've just got the one last question. I don't think I've seen any others come through. Is that right? So the last question's from Irene, who's in Bangladesh at the moment. Hi, Irene. And Irene asks, how do we assess what works in terms of changing public attitudes and behaviour? What a great question. So many ways to answer it. I suppose I want to start on the point about campaigns. And again, go back to the piece of work I did a number of years ago now, looking at international campaigns internationally on challenging men's violence against women. And what I found in doing the research to support an exhibition that we brought to Glasgow. And what I found with my colleagues when we were doing that research was that very, very, very few campaigns internationally, public education campaigns, are evaluated. And as far as we can tell, the main reason for that is funding. So funding, agencies are often able to get funding to run a campaign because there's deemed to be a need, but actually the evaluations of those campaigns are very often just not there. And so it would be great to see, and one of the things we should be pushing for, I think, is more fully funded campaigns where actually there is post-campaign evaluation to see what the long-term impacts on behaviour are. The kind of things we have seen with campaigns and often has been evaluated kind of even quite locally is how campaigns can be really effective at raising awareness of the issues. So things like Zero Tolerance campaign, which we've heard about quite a bit this week. There's been a fair amount of research about campaign recognition, that people know what it is, that they understand the message. So we know that these messages are seen and heard. What we don't know as much about is whether they've got long-term effects on behaviour, and that's certainly an area for future research. Another thing we do know, however, and this is a broader point about the media rather than campaigns specifically, is that whenever whenever there's a high-profile case, be that a campaign or a news item or sort of a viral campaign, hashtag campaign like Me Too, whenever there are campaigns of that magnitude that attract a lot of attention on social media and in the press and on television, calls to helpline numbers. So if it's domestic abuse, calls to women's aid agencies. If it's about sexual violence, calls to rape crisis go up. I mentioned the Jimmy Savile case earlier. Things like Childline in the UK, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, all of those organisations saw huge spikes in self-referral when that case was in the headlines. Now that might be an odd thing to say, what works, but I suppose what I'm saying there is we know that talking about these issues creates the demand for support. Now that has both positive and negative elements, because sometimes that's because media coverage has been traumatising, re-traumatising for victim survivors, and often where the coverage has been poor, that might be particularly the case. But on the positive side, for many people it's about understanding that others have shared their experience and that there is help and support available. So it is a little bit of a double-edged sword in that sense, but that is one thing that we know works. We know that talking about it increases the demand for services, and in some ways that can never be a bad thing. I suppose what is bad is that those services aren't then necessarily funded to follow up on that work. So again, that's something we need to be really, really conscious of. I think we've definitely seen some attitudinal and behavioural shifts in terms of what is deemed acceptable of public figures. But I think those changes are difficult to secure, so they're difficult to embed culturally without structural change. And they're also applied really unevenly. So different standards of behaviour for one group of people than for another, for instance. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do. I think we still need to know a lot more about what works in terms of behavioural change. But also to go back to the point, who was it, that Dola had made about Me Too. I think we are at a point now where our understanding, public understanding of the issues in many contexts globally, and I've been really heartened to hear in your comments about a number of different contexts in which this is true, not just those that we've written about and talked about most this week, that we are at a stage where our public understanding of these issues is shifting, and that raises, I think, the question of the next step. Okay, so how can we sustain this change in the media? How can we ensure that media organisations don't just get this right when a big story like Me Too breaks, but that actually it's a structural change in the way that they report year on year, day on day, perpetually. So lots of work to do, and still more we need to know in research terms. Okay, so if there are no further questions from you, thanks again for your participation and questions today and throughout the last 4 weeks. I'm really enjoying hearing what you come up with, so please do continue to share your examples, ask questions, and we'll be back for another live stream in week 7, so the final week of the class. So any questions that you have for any of the weeks from now until then, make sure you post them in that final week so that we don't lose track of them and can pick up on your questions. And I'll look forward to talking with you again then and to hearing your comments in the meantime. So till then, cheerio.